Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're jumping into a really pivotal moment in American history. We're looking at the complex links between politics and the economy during the Civil War.
That's right.
We've got this chapter excerpt, 19 Politics and Economy in the Civil War, which gives us a good foundation. Our goal here is to really unpack the core political moves, the big economic shifts, and, the kind of leadership that defined this whole era, hopefully giving you a clear sense of how it all fit together.
Exactly. The Civil War, it wasn't just battles. It was this intense period of political maneuvering, huge economic changes.
Yeah.
It fundamentally reshaped the country.
Yeah.
And the source, it's a really good lens for seeing how those forces kind of pushed and pulled against each other and ultimately how they shaped the war's outcome.
Okay, so let's start maybe with Lincoln's early presidency. He steps into a situation that's already, well, it's practically boiling over, isn't it?
Teetering on the brink, yeah.
His inaugural address is fascinating. He's trying to be firm, really firm, on keeping the Union together. That line, physically speaking, we cannot separate, especially about federal spots like Fort Sumter.
Right.
But he's also trying this really delicate balancing act, isn't he? Trying not to push those border slave states any further away.
That's such a critical point. It was an incredibly tricky position to be in. For Republicans, for Unionist Democrats, that firm stance, that was strength. That was essential.
Yeah.
But for the lower South, the states that had already left, those exact same words sounded like a threat, like a declaration of war. It just shows how far apart things had gotten. Almost no common ground left at that point.
And then there's his first cabinet. You've got Seward at State, Chase at the Treasury, later Stanton at War. These were big personalities, powerful figures,
Definitely.
each with their own ambitions, and from what the source says, pretty strong opinions. The clashes just inside that leadership group must have been another huge pressure point for Lincoln.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting is how Lincoln handled them. You mentioned Chase, a major abolitionist, definitely had his eye on the presidency later.
Right.
His ideas often clashed with someone like Seward, who was maybe more of a political pragmatist.
Okay.
Then Stanton comes in, a war Democrat, so supporting the war, but from the Democratic side. He brought his own kind of forceful energy. Lincoln's ability to manage all that, sort of harness their talents while keeping the infighting from derailing everything as they headed towards war, that really says something about his political skill.
It really does.
He'd often let them debate things openly in cabinet meetings. Sometimes it got heated, apparently, but it also meant people felt involved and maybe the final decisions were stronger for it.
It definitely highlights those leadership skills. The source talks about his knack for understanding public opinion, shaping it even, his patience. Incredible patience, really, under all that pressure, and how he'd managed to appeal to so many different groups during the campaign. It's almost like those skills were, essential training for what was coming.
That's a great way to put it. And yeah, those skills got tested immediately with Fort Sumter.
Right.
Strategically vital, right there at the mouth of Charleston Harbor. It was one of the last symbols of federal power down there, along with Fort Pickering in Florida.
And the situation was getting desperate, supplies running out. Major Anderson was basically telling Lincoln, look, without supplies, we'll have to surrender.
Yeah.
So Lincoln's in a real bind. Do nothing, you look weak. Send troops to reinforce it. You look like the aggressor. Maybe start the war yourself.
And that decision point is key, isn't it? His strategic thinking there. He picked a kind of middle way.
How so?
He told South Carolina he was sending a mission only to bring food, provisions to the existing soldiers. He specifically said it wasn't reinforcement.
Oh, okay.
It was a really calculated move. Basically, put the ball in their court. If they fired on a ship just bringing food, well, they'd be the ones starting the fight.
And they fell for it, or rather, they took the bait. The supply ship sails April 9th, 1861.
Unarmed ship.
Right, unarmed. And the Confederates saw it as aggression anyway, like it was reinforcement in disguise, which led straight to the bombardment on April 12th. 34 hours of cannons firing. Anderson finally surrenders on the 13th.
And amazingly, no one killed in the bombardment itself, though the fort was battered.
Yeah, incredible. But the political fallout, that was huge.
Massive. Before Sumter, there was a decent chunk of opinion up north that might have just said, okay, let him go. Peacefully, maybe. But the attack, it just galvanized the North. Suddenly, it wasn't about maybe letting them go. It was about defending the Union, defending national honor.
Right.
So in that sense, Lincoln's gamble, risky as it was, worked. It framed the South as the ones who started the shooting.
Absolutely. And Lincoln's reaction was fast. April 15th, he calls for 75,000 militia volunteers, only for 90 days initially.
Right, that initial short-term view.
And then April 19th, the blockade of southern ports.
Yeah.
It wasn't very effective at first, apparently, but it would become massive later on.
Crucial, yeah.
And then he realized 90 days wasn't going to cut it, so May 3rd, he calls for volunteers for 3 years.
A much more realistic time frame, sadly.
And the source mentions Washington, D.C. itself felt really exposed in those first weeks.
Understandably so. And the South's reaction to that call for troops, just as big. 4 more states seceded: Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina.
Virginia leaving was a huge blow to the Union, symbolically and strategically.
Absolutely, and that led the Confederacy to move its capital from Montgomery up to Richmond, much closer to the action, really solidified the battle lines.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit to those border slave states.
Yeah.
Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, later West Virginia. The source really stresses how important it was that they stayed in the Union.
Hugely important.
And apparently a big reason they stayed was the feeling that the North hadn't actually started the war.
That perception mattered, yeah. And their contribution. Wow, something like 300,000 soldiers for the Union Army came from those states.
That's a massive number.
Yeah.
You can see why Lincoln reportedly said that famous line about Kentucky. I hope to have God on my side, but I had to have Kentucky.
Exactly. It underscores their strategic value. And these states, they were really torn internally. It wasn't just North versus South. You had families divided. You had slaveholders fighting for the Union and others fighting for the Confederacy. It wasn't a simple free soil versus slavery fight right at the beginning.
Right. The source mentions these border states had over half the South's white population, but actually fewer slaves proportionally.
Which partly explains that complex dynamic. And you even had West Virginia breaking away from Virginia in '61, forming its own state, largely because it didn't align with the plantation economy. Just shows the fractures.
And Lincoln wasn't afraid to use force to keep control in those areas, was he?
No, he wasn't. Martial law in Maryland, troops sent into West Virginia and Missouri. Missouri especially saw brutal fighting, like a mini civil war within the state itself.
All to keep Washington, D.C. from being surrounded, essentially.
Exactly, keep those states secure. But publicly, he had to be so careful. He walked a real tightrope in his statements.
How so?
He kept hammering the message. This war is about saving the Union, period. He deliberately downplayed the slavery issue, at least early on.
Which politically probably helped keep the border states in line.
It likely did.
But it must have angered the abolitionists.
Oh, absolutely. They heavily criticized him for it. They felt he was compromising on the moral issue. That famous letter he wrote to Horace Greeley in August '62 sums it up perfectly. He basically said, my main goal is saving the Union, not saving or destroying slavery.
Right. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it.
And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. It shows just how focused he was on that primary goal, even if it frustrated some.
Got it. And the source also mentions, interestingly, that most of the 5 civilized tribes in Indian Territory actually sided with the Confederacy.
Yeah, a complex situation there, too, involving past treaties, economic ties, various factors pulling them towards the South.
Okay, so let's weigh the odds at the start.
Yeah.
The Confederacy. They did have some things going for them, didn't they?
They definitely perceived some advantages. Fighting defensively on their own land, familiar ground, that's usually easier.
Right.
And initially, there was maybe a stronger sense of moral purpose for some, the idea of self-determination, fighting for their way of life, however flawed we see it now.
And their military leadership is often cited. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, very talented commanders.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating about Lee, the source notes he was personally against slavery and secession.
Yeah, and Lincoln offered him command of the Union Army.
It just shows you the power of loyalty to your state, to Virginia in his case. It trumped even his personal views on the core issues, a really complex decision.
But those advantages, they were countered by some major weaknesses, right?
Huge weaknesses. Their industrial capacity was just tiny compared to the North. They struggled with shortages of pretty much everything as the war went on. Transportation broke down. And the things he might have hoped for, like all the border states joining them, or the North just giving up, or crucially getting help from Europe.
That foreign intervention never really came.
No, it didn't. And that failure, especially the failure to get Britain and France officially involved, was a massive blow to their chances.
So turning to the North, their advantages seem almost overwhelming on paper.
They really do. Much larger population, constantly boosted by immigration, far more wealth. Dominance in manufacturing, shipping, banking, railroads, you name it.
Plus, control the sea with the Navy and the blockade.
Absolutely. And the ideal of the Union itself, preserving the nation, that became a powerful moral cause for many Northerners, especially as the war dragged on.
And their logistics, their weapons production, that ramped up over time, too.
Generally, yes. They had the capacity to learn and adapt their war machine in ways the South just couldn't match.
But even with all that, the North had internal issues, too. And interestingly, the source contrasts the Confederate Constitution with the Union setup.
Yeah, that's a key point. The Confederate Constitution puts such a strong emphasis on states' rights.
Ironically.
Right. Ironically, it really hampered Jefferson Davis's ability to centralize control and run an effective war effort. He was constantly battling state governors who didn't want to give up power or resources.
So the very principle they fought for undermined their ability to fight.
To a significant extent, yes. Davis just didn't have the political leeway or maybe the political skill that Lincoln had to consolidate power and direct the nation. Lincoln faced opposition, sure, but the federal government structure was fundamentally stronger.
Fascinating. Okay, let's talk about Europe. The diplomacy during the war. You mentioned the Confederacy hoped for intervention. Initially, it seems like the European upper classes were kind of rooting for them.
Many were, yeah, particularly the aristocracy in Britain and France. Part of it was maybe a bit of skepticism about this whole American democracy experiment, and part was economic. They liked the idea of an independent South providing cotton without Union tariffs getting in the way. Some weapons were sold, too.
But the whole King Cotton strategy, banking on Europe needing their cotton so badly they'd have to intervene, that didn't work out. Why not?
Several reasons. First, Britain actually had a huge cotton surplus stored up right when the war started in '61, so the immediate pressure wasn't as high as the South thought.
Ah, okay. Bad timing for the Confederacy.
Very bad timing. Then later, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, that changed the whole moral dimension of the war.
How so?
It made it clearly about slavery. And the working classes in Britain and France, they strongly opposed slavery. It made it politically very difficult for their governments to side with the Confederacy fighting to preserve slavery.
Right. It gave the North the moral high ground internationally.
Exactly. Plus, the Union managed to ship some cotton out. British war industries were actually booming, supplying both sides. And crucially, Britain needed northern grain imports. It wasn't just about cotton.
So the economic ties are more complex.
Much more complex than just King Cotton.
And that Trent affair, that sounds like it was a really close call with Britain.
Oh, it was huge. A Union warship stopping a British mail ship, arresting Confederate diplomats on board. The British were furious. There was serious talk of war.
Wow.
Lincoln eventually, and reluctantly, decided to release the diplomats. He famously said, "one war at a time." It was smart diplomacy to back down, even though it was unpopular with some in the North. It avoided disaster.
Yeah, a second war would have been catastrophic.
Absolutely. And even though Britain stayed officially neutral, the source points out it was kind of an unofficial naval base for the Confederacy for a while.
How did that work?
British shipyards built commerce raiders, ships designed to attack Union merchant vessels. The most famous was the CSS Alabama.
Manned by Brits.
Mostly, yeah. It did a lot of damage to Union shipping. The U.S. minister in London, Charles Francis Adams, he worked tirelessly to protest this and stop Britain from formally recognizing the Confederacy.
So he was crucial.
Very crucial. Then there was the Laird Rams incident in '63. These were powerful, ironclad warships being built in Britain for the Confederacy. Real potential game changers.
A lot happened.
Adams basically told the British government, look, if these ships sail, it means war. The British government got the message and ended up buying the ships themselves to keep them out of Confederate hands.
Another close call averted. But those raiders, while damaging, didn't cripple the Union war effort overall.
No, they were a nuisance, costly, but didn't fundamentally change the naval balance or the blockade's effectiveness in the long run.
In France, Napoleon III wasn't exactly friendly to the Union either.
No, he took advantage of the U.S. being distracted by the Civil War to invade Mexico and install Maximilian as emperor. A clear violation of the Monroe Doctrine.
Right. How did the U.S. handle that?
Cautiously during the war. They couldn't afford another conflict. But after the war ended, Secretary of State Seward put the diplomatic pressure on, and France eventually pulled out, leaving Maximilian to his fate.
Okay, let's talk about actually raising the armies. Both sides started with volunteers.
Right.
Lots of enthusiasm initially.
Loads of enthusiasm. But as the war dragged on, the casualties mounted, that initial wave wasn't enough.
So they turned to conscription, the draft.
Yes. Both sides did. The Confederacy actually started earlier in 1862. The North followed in 1863.
And it wasn't popular, was it? Especially the part where you could pay someone to take your place.
Not at all. That rich man's war, poor man's fight idea really took hold. If you had enough money, in both North and South, you could hire a substitute or pay a commutation fee to avoid service.
Which led to things like the New York draft riots in '63.
Exactly. Huge, violent protests, largely by working-class immigrants who resented being drafted while wealthier men could buy their way out. It had racial overtones, too, tragically.
And a really crucial part of the Union Army story is the role of African-American soldiers.
Absolutely vital. Initially, the Union government was hesitant, even rejected black volunteers. But policy changed, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation. Around 180,000 black men served in the Union Army and Navy. That's about 10% of total Union enlistments.
Wow, 10%.
Yeah. Their contribution was immense. They fought bravely, suffered heavy casualties, about 38,000 died. Lincoln himself later said their service was critical to the Union victory.
What about the Confederacy? Did they use enslaved people as soldiers?
Only very late in the war, and in very limited numbers. It was hugely controversial within the Confederacy. They did, however, use enslaved labor extensively throughout the war, building fortifications, working in factories, farming, essential support roles.
And the source mentions that widespread slave revolts didn't happen, but many enslaved people did escape to Union lines when they could.
Right. Seeking freedom. Their movement towards Union armies was itself a significant factor in the war.
Let's switch to the money side. How did they pay for this incredibly expensive war? The North first.
The North used a mix of things. They introduced the first federal income tax, small by today's standards, but still significant then. They ramped up excise taxes, especially on things like tobacco and alcohol, and they passed the Morrill Tariff Act in '61, raising import duties, which also helped protect northern industries. They kept raising tariffs throughout the war.
What about borrowing? Or just printing money?
Both. They issued paper money called greenbacks, not backed by gold or silver, which was controversial but necessary. And they sold huge amounts of government bonds to the public. Financiers like Jay Cooke were really effective at marketing these bonds to ordinary citizens.
Okay, and the national banking system. That sounds important.
It was established in 1863. The idea was to create a more stable national currency, get rid of all the different state banknotes, and also create a reliable market for those government bonds. Banks had to buy bonds to join the system. It really shaped American finance for decades.
So the North had several tools. What about the South? Their financial situation sounds much worse.
Much, much worse. The blockade basically cut off their main source of revenue, customs duties from cotton exports. They tried selling bonds, but it was harder to find buyers, especially abroad. They raised taxes, including a really unpopular tax requiring farmers to give 10% of their produce to the government.
Ouch. That wouldn't go over well.
No, it didn't. So their main resort, printing huge amounts of paper money, Confederate dollars.
Which leads to?
Massive runaway inflation. The money became worth less and less. It devastated their economy and morale.
So despite the cost, the North's economy actually grew during the war.
In some ways.
Yeah, parts of it boomed. The source talks about a new class of millionaires emerging. Factories popped up, shielded by those new tariffs, making war supplies. Labor-saving machines became more common because so many men were away fighting. The oil industry in Pennsylvania got its start, and westward expansion didn't stop. You had the Homestead Act in '62 giving free land to settlers, the Morrill Act setting up land-grant colleges, the Pacific Railway Act starting the Transcontinental Railroad project.
So a lot of foundational stuff happening even during the war. But northern shipping suffered. Yeah, that was the one sector that took a big hit from those Confederate commerce raiders like the Alabama.
And the Southern economy.
The Cotton Kingdom.
Devastated. The blockade choked off exports, and Union armies caused widespread destruction. It basically collapsed.
Okay, one last major area. Lincoln and civil liberties. This is always a tricky subject in wartime.
Always.
Lincoln argued he had to sometimes bend the Constitution to save the Union itself. And Congress mostly went along with it.
For the most part, yes. He took actions that were constitutionally questionable, maybe, proclaiming the blockade on his own authority, increasing the army size without initial congressional approval, spending money without appropriation.
And suspending habeas corpus. That's the big one, isn't it?
That's the most famous, yes.
Yeah.
The right to not be imprisoned unlawfully without cause shown in court. Lincoln suspended it in certain areas, allowing military authorities to arrest and detain suspected Confederate sympathizers or spies without trial.
There was that ex parte Merriman case where Chief Justice Taney said Lincoln couldn't do that, only Congress could. Right. Taney issued the ruling, but Lincoln essentially ignored it, arguing the president needed that power in a rebellion. It really highlights that tension between executive power and individual rights in a crisis. Congress did later pass a law authorizing the suspension in 1863.
Were lots of people arrested? Did it suppress dissent?
Some people were certainly arrested, maybe thousands over the course of the war. There was supervised voting in border states. Some newspapers critical of the war were temporarily shut down. But the source does make the point that overall, civil liberties were generally respected compared to other conflicts, maybe. Most political opponents weren't jailed. It wasn't a total suppression of dissent.
And interestingly, Lincoln signed a bill outlawing slavery in federal territories, despite the Dred Scott ruling saying Congress couldn't do that.
Yeah, another example of pushing the boundaries in wartime. And again, you see the contrast with Davis in the South.
Full.
Because of the strong states' rights sentiment in the Confederacy, Davis often found it much harder to impose central authority or take actions that infringed on local rights, even for the war effort. Lincoln, despite the criticisms, had more room to maneuver politically.
So, wrapping this up, this deep dive really shows how politics and economics were just completely tangled together during the Civil War, doesn't it?
Absolutely inseparable. The political decisions affected the economy, the economic realities shaped the political choices. It was a constant feedback loop.
And Lincoln's leadership, navigating that political maze, dealing with his cabinet, public opinion, the border states, while also taking these really extraordinary steps on things like civil liberties. It's just remarkable.
It really is. And the economic changes, the boom in the North, the collapse in the South, those transformations didn't just end in 1865. They set the stage for America's economic future for generations.
Yeah.
You know, it makes you think the legacy of those decisions, those wartime measures. Questions about federal power versus states' rights, the government's role in the economy, balancing security and liberty. These aren't just historical issues, are they?
Not at all. Still debated constantly today.
So maybe a final thought for you listening. When you look at the challenges the nation faced, then the political divisions, the economic strains, the questions of power and rights, what echoes do you see in the complexities and decisions we face today? Are there parallels? It's certainly something worth pondering.